All right. We have been talking for a while on this show. I think the last 2 weeks or so, we've been talking about Plato's cave. And I've been promising for a while that as we build up some of these ideas and trace them throughout the history of Western thought, we're eventually going to get to the modern day. And now is the time. I want to talk to you about Plato's cave and the metaverse. Let me say a little bit about why I want to bring Plato's cave into our modern techno world. Obviously, this is a show for delivering the classical education that you didn't know you were missing to you. It's called Young Heretics because it's becoming increasingly heretical, according to social justice dogma or woke dogma or whatever you want to call it, to explore the great traditions of the West and to affirm them and hold them up as the jewels of really some of the jewels of human thought. And when we do that, of course, it has its own pleasure to dig into the archives of the greats. But we always want to keep in mind, I think, that one of the central aspects of a good education is to always keep in mind that these fancy books, these famous writers and these, big idea philosophers, they're great precisely because they have something to say to you, something that speaks to perennial facts about human nature, core aspects of your heart, mind, and soul. And those things don't change even when history marches on. And we're, of course, going through, I think it's plain to see, a really transformative moment in history, having a lot to do with the digital revolution and the new kinds of tech and the new relationship that we have with our technology, but also with some of the, I call them crises that we are having about these deep philosophical questions, this loss of confidence in some of the old answers, the old and true answers to questions like, why am I here? What is a human? What is a man? What is a woman? Right? And so it's really fortuitous that we're reaching this central question of Plato's cave and what is real, as we are also letting you guys know about my book, How to Save the West, Ancient Wisdom for 5 Modern Crises. I've told you guys now that it's available for pre-order. You can get it on Amazon. But, even when you pre-order it, you're not going to get it for a while. But now that you know it's out there, I want to kind of take the lid off of some of the ideas that are in it, because I've been mulling over, how is it that in this radically changing time, as we're addressing all of these sort of crazy new concerns like AI and the metaverse and the multiverse and transgenderism, how can we understand the implications of something like Plato's cave for a time when people are proposing that virtual reality and augmented reality is going to totally change the way we relate to the world? And so what I'm going to do, as the book kind of gets closer and closer to release, I'm not going to only ever talk about the book on the show, but I am going to do a few series of episodes in which I kind of explore with you guys the themes of the chapters and the way that the book is structured, as it's Ancient Wisdom for 5 Modern Crises. So it's got 5 parts, and each one, the first chapter talks about a crisis that we're facing. So the crisis of reality, or the crisis of the body with transgenderism, right? And that first chapter kind of outlines the crisis and some of the perennial issues that it raises from Western philosophy. The second chapter talks about what are some of the best answers that have been come up with to these deeper questions. Because one of the things that tech does, even though it presents us with all these new opportunities, tech like virtual reality, it raises up also these very ancient and deep questions, sort of fundamental questions. Before you even get to, like, are you a Christian or are you Jewish, right? You have to get to, like, is there absolute truth? Is there reality? Is there a God? And so the book is a way of kind of pulling back the camera on some of the stuff you see in the news and saying, what's the deeper crisis at work here? What's the philosophical crisis at work? What's the thing in your own heart that you're going to have to resolve to move forward? And so the first thing I want to look at with Plato's cave is virtual reality and the metaverse. Let's get into it. You guys, I have been spreading the gospel of public goods basically since I started doing this show, and it never gets old. I have basically like all of their kitchen stuff, like all their soaps and their coffee and all the snacks and everything. And it just all looks good. Like you can kind of count on them to knock it out of the park, which is really cool. It's nice to have a place that you can rely on in so many different ways. You can rely on their packaging to be really aesthetically pleasing. You can rely on their ingredients to not be all weird and chemically. I'm a bit of a health nut, so that's particularly good for me. You just know that if you go to public goods and you get basically anything, you're going to get a high quality, thoughtfully designed product. You all know that I fiend on the chocolate-covered almonds all the time. This stuff actually really does matter. And like I say, this is a brand that I just rely on and trust. So check them out. They have a special deal just for my listeners where you can get $15 off your first public goods order with no minimum purchase. It's a really sweet deal. One of the best deals around when you go to publicgoods.com/heretics, publicgoods.com/heretics to get $15 off your first order. I'm going to start this exploration of reality and the cave and virtual reality, applying Plato's imagery of the cave from Book Sound. I'm going to start by reading a tweet that is dragging me. It's putting me on blast, as they say. Whatever slang you want to use to say. Like over at the American Mind, we have the podcast called The Roundtable, and it's a great opportunity every week to kind of get together with the guys that run the American Mind at the Claremont Institute and talk about some of the things that are in the news. And this anonymous, I don't know who this is. This is an anonymous account. It's called Angelo Respector. He tweeted out, "I tried listening to the latest Claremont podcast thing, and they were still spurging out about the metaverse, even though it is now official that Meta is losing several $billion per quarter on the metaverse, and every tester still says this is just a worse Second Life." So just spurging out, for those that don't know, it's a reference to Asperger's, which is a form of autism. And it's the idea that we're kind of like drilling down into this crazy theory about like how we're all going to be uploaded into virtual reality. And this guy's saying this is all ridiculous. This is all hype. This is just marketing for a new product. And it's not even working. It's not even making any money over at Facebook, where they've proposed to turn, social media into virtual media and virtual reality. And I think that this is like totally fair point. Well taken, right? And this actually speaks to something that I think is really important for when we address these tech questions. Because I'm not a tech expert. I'm not here to tell you, exactly how each form of technology is going to come into being. But I will say, right, that I agree that a lot of stuff that you hear about the metaverse, or even like Facebook turning into Meta, this whole idea that virtual reality is going to be the new thing, a lot of it is a marketing ploy. And that is to say, it's a sales pitch that comes to you in the form of, this is the inevitable new thing, right? And this is part of the business model for basically all tech, is representing the new tech that they want to sell you as the future and the inevitable direction that we're going. And if you don't buy this, if you resist it, if you have criticisms of it, then you're just digging in your heels against progress. And you're going to look awfully silly in the end when it turns out that the metaverse comes into being and, you're left behind. And what I want to tease apart here, actually, is the distinction between those sales pitches that people might give us, which we can accept or reject, versus the ways of looking at the world that they reveal. Because, like Facebook's transition to Meta might work, it might not. Fortnite might turn out to be a game that endures, it might not. But in the sales pitches that they give us, in the ways that they have of selling their tech to us, we start to see how some of the richest and most powerful people in the world look at humanity and our place within the world. And that is where we can start to uncover some of the logic, not only of our kind of modern techno-futurist philosophy, but some of the crises that are being raised by these issues, some of the ancient questions that are being raised, so that we can then go back to the great works of the West and find what answers those works have for these questions. And so to me, the question of the metaverse is much less a question, are we all going to be able to like put on virtual glasses and live in a virtual world, and much more of a question, is there true and false at all? Is there such a thing as objective reality? Because I really believe that is the first great question of the Western philosophical tradition. It begins with Socrates, right? Socrates is engaging with all of these philosophers who go before him, people like Heraclitus, right? And even Parmenides, who's kind of a positive influence in some ways on Socrates, and Gorgias and the sophists that are contemporary with Socrates, are all raising this painful, difficult question. What is truth? Is there such a thing as truth? Or is Heraclitus right and all things are in flux because, as I've said many times now on the podcast, right, there's a way in which Heraclitus is right. We live in this world of impermanence. And some Greek words that are associated with this are like phora, right, which is decay, or togonomenon, right, that which is always coming into being and passing away. And the claim, the sort of heart of the sophist claim, as Plato represents it, is that that's all there is. Everything is just always changing and passing away. And when that is your belief system, it turns out that the only thing you can believe in is the assertion of power. And one of my claims in the book is that that crisis, the crisis of, well, everything is just, nothing's either good or bad, but thinking makes it so, and therefore we just need to exert power over one another. That crisis has come up again and again in the West, and it's sort of the perennial crisis that Western philosophy begins with. It begins with Socrates planting his feet and saying, no, not in addition to togonomenon, in addition to the things that are coming into being and passing away, there is also on, that which is, the eternal things, the good, the true, and the beautiful that we talk about on this show. So let's get into some of the kind of philosophy around the metaverse as a way of understanding this, I call it the reality crisis, in our present day. I'm going to just give you my kind of, I call this my smooth brain take on, what is the metaverse or what is any given form of tech. And I mean that kind of in a good way, because a lot of times the people that are actually, knowledgeable about tech to the extent that they can create it, aren't able to present it in a way that sort of like a regular guy might understand. When it comes to tech, I'm just a regular dude like the rest of you, and here is what I understand to be the selling pitch or the proposition behind metaverse technology or virtual reality technology or whatever, right? It sort of hinges around these three different versions of the internet, right? Web 1, Web 2, Web 3. First version of the internet, Web 1, when the internet really gets started, this is like most people are just consumers. So you log on and you read something online that somebody else has written, right? And as the internet, begins to take shape and you can connect to other people's computers, like that's sort of what it is used for. You're accessing information in some database that somebody else created. Web 2, right? People become the producers. And the cynical version of this, of course, is people become the product, right? And that was the old ad campaign from the 1970s. Like, if you're not paying anything, then you're the product, right? And so this was the gradual realization in Web 2. This is like blogs and podcasts and social media and all that stuff. Around 2004, this starts to become a thing, right? That now many people who use the internet are also creating the content that is on the internet. And I think also about like the transition between being like a middle schooler who sat in the computer lab and watched E-Bombs World or like, whatever Homestar Runner or whatever call out you want, this stuff that other people were producing, but then you realize that you could do Flash and you could make stuff too, right? So it was very exciting, but also we sort of eventually soured on it as we realized that a lot of our data was being mined and all this stuff, right? So that's Web 2, that's sort of like what we think of now as the internet. Web 3 sort of hinges on this idea. The notion that there's now going to be a Web 3 hinges on this idea of interoperability. I mean, that's where we get, the virtual reality and the augmented reality, and like, you're going to be able to upload your consciousness into the cloud, right? All of this comes from, well, what if instead of living like on your computer, the internet lived sort of all around you? And the video game Fortnite, the reason that I mentioned the video game Fortnite is because this is one of the first instances of interoperability, because it's a game that you can play on like every different platform, and you can own items in the sort of virtual items in the game that transfer to your different devices, right? And that starts to create this sense that actually the internet isn't like on our computers. We're in the internet, right? We're living in it. And so even if it has nothing to do with virtual reality or virtual goggles or whatever, right? The notion of Web3 is that the internet kind of becomes this, some people call it a shared virtual space, right? And so when, Zuckerberg came out with that famous video where he announced that he was, going to turn Facebook into Meta. He was not inventing the metaverse. The whole concept of the metaverse is like, it's in science fiction. I think the term comes from this book Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. And it's been, The Matrix, all sorts of examples of the idea that you could be uploaded, or you could believe that you live in this virtual reality. Zuckerberg wasn't inventing any of that. He was just saying Facebook is now going to transition to like ride this Web3 wave, sort of, by the way. And by the way, there's like a a Web 4 idea, which is that then we become kind of symbiotic with our machines, right? And that's like, your smartphone isn't just your smartphone, it's also a chip in your brain and all this stuff. But we're not going to get into that so much today, except as like, to show you kind of how this sort of thought, again, we're looking for like underlying logic. How does this sort of thought work, right? And so Zuckerberg was basically saying like, Facebook is betting on this Web3 thing. It's betting on the idea that the future of the web is for it to be all around you. And NFTs, of course, are part of this. And so is cryptocurrency, right? The idea that you can have things that you own, currency, for instance, that you own that is interoperable and transfers from platform to platform, goes with you, lives around you, rather than in some one specific device. If you're a gamer, you know that there's this very frustrating phenomenon that a game will come out and it'll just be on Xbox. And it's like, well, I just spent $1 gajillion on my PlayStation 5 or whatever, and now like how can I play this game that I really want to? And interoperability is designed basically to smash down all such walls, and so the internet then becomes like the environment that you live in, the area in which we live, breathe, and have our being. And so here's Zuckerberg, right? And this video that made a big splash, it was at the Connect conference, which is a conference that Facebook, now Meta, does for virtual reality. He says, we've gone from desktop to web to phones, from text to photos to video, but this isn't the end of the line. The next platform and medium will be even more immersive, an embodied internet where you're in the experience, not just looking at it. And we call this the metaverse. And this, I begin the first chapter of the book, I begin with this quote, not because of the like Facebook of it all, but because this is a road into sort of thinking about how our elites decide and discern reality and what they believe we're even about, right? And so let's take some time now to dig a little bit deeper into this way of looking at the world, which again, for me, is representative of the reality crisis, right? This idea that the line between imaginary and stable or real is actually kind of an inconvenient line. And we would be much better off, and our lives would go much better, and we'd have much more pleasure if we could just blur that line, right? And you'll note that all of these, again, right, are always about brand deals, right? It's like Facebook's becoming Meta, or Fortnite is making these deals with different brands to sell their products that look like their stuff on their game, and this is part of the business proposition, and the business proposition in turn is based on a philosophical attitude. And that philosophical attitude, whatever company does or does not end up being successful, right, that philosophical attitude matters. I mean, you see like countries like Korea, South Korea are going like way more into this. Than even we are, but our elites too. I mean, I'm going to get into talking about the World Economic Forum in a bit. They're big on metaverse type technology as well. And once again, right, like this speaks to their philosophy of life. It speaks to how they look at the world. So let's just review a couple of the sort of most interesting news stories that have come out of this whole way of talking about the metaverse. One is that this is from Business Insider. There was a researcher who was checking out Horizon. Now, Horizon is the sort of metaverse social media platform. It's a social networking platform, basically, where instead of logging onto Twitter and scrolling through things, you put on your virtual reality glasses and you move through this sort of space where other people are also wearing virtual reality glasses, right? And she reported that she was raped or she was sexually assaulted in this space, right? And this was part of her research, was to try to see if this is actually a toxic space for women, just like social media and so forth. And, and what's intriguing to me about this, right, is that the idea here is if your digital avatar comes over to my digital avatar and invades my space and does stuff that I don't want, then that's kind of tantamount to if we were physically together and you physically coerced me into a sexual encounter, right? And so the whole notion, right, is that the line between true and false can be blurred to such an extent that the things that happen in your mind only have the same level of reality as the things that happen that have some sort of stable existence outside of us, right? this translates in one context into what's called Tamagotchi children, right? So here's another news story. This woman, Catriona Campbell, talking about, how you could have virtual children in the metaverse, right? You could have a being that sort of gives you love and affection and depends on you, and you can feed it and play with it. But says Campbell, if you're not looking for full-time kids, you can simply switch your child off. If your virtual child spawns into a teenage monster, you can simply cancel your subscription or ignore the kid, right? And so again, right, I'm not saying that that's going to be the thing that everybody buys. I'm just saying, like, look at how these people are talking, right, about reality, as if, right, the only thing that matters is what exists inside your head, right? The experience that you have of a child is related to nothing other than your personal feelings about that child, right? And so actually it would be much more convenient and helpful if we could control the experience entirely, right? And who cares about the notion that there may or may not actually be another human soul on the other side of that relationship, right? I mean, if you're dealing with a virtual child, you're dealing with a non-conscious entity, something for which there is no internal experience. We're going to get into that in a bit later on, right? But there's something for which that this is just a sort of representation that makes you feel the same way that you might feel if you had an actual child that you loved and cared for, right? And the only difference is, right, that by sort of deciding not to pay attention to the distinction between real and unreal, by confusing that distinction, you can have all the pleasure of a child with none of the hassle of a real soul to whom you are responsible, right? Now we start to get into, I think, unpacking, again, not what tech is necessarily going to succeed in the future, so much as how our elites right now look at the world. Reality is what we make of it. Our inner experience is what matters. If we like something, if we feel pleasure, it doesn't matter if that pleasure is related to virtual imagination or if it's related to an actual living, breathing human being on the other side of that. You can start to see, I think, probably how this is related to Plato's cave. But in a second, we're going to get into the cave itself, right, and how that works. So just the other day, I got an email from work with like compliance stuff from HR. And I was like, I'm so glad somebody's doing this that is not me. I love our HR person and she's so good at what she does. But if you are not able in your small business to hire a full-time HR person, then Bambee is the place to go. It's spelled Bambee. And they're a fantastic service that helps small business owners to manage all of these gajillion bureaucratic HR functionary concerns, because this country is like, totally just chock full now of all these different red tape laws and things that you have to deal with if you're starting a business. And I don't want you to have to worry about any of that stuff if you're starting a business. It's so important that we have small businesses in this country. I know that a lot of my listeners are involved in small businesses or own small businesses themselves. And I think that is like so cool. It's one of my favorite parts of the Young Heretics audience. And I don't want you to get tripped up in that noble and important endeavor by some picayune compliance concern that you didn't do quite right. And now you're going to be wrapped up in a lawsuit that's going to drain all your time and all your money. It can cost a lot of money to pay an in-house HR manager, up to $80,000 a year. But with Bambee, your dedicated HR manager starts at just $99 a month. So they take care of this stuff for you way more affordably. When you go to Bambee.com/heretics, you can get a free HR audit. You've got to use that special link that's just for my listeners, Bambee.com/heretics, Bambee.com/heretics. Don't let HR get in the way. So before we continue with some of the theory of the metaverse, right, theory of virtual reality and the reality crisis, let me just remind you about Plato's cave, because we're on this whole kick because we started with Plato's Republic, Book 7, which is the famous allegory of the cave. I've been talking about it for a while and what it means about what I would call systemic sophistry, right? People say we have a systemic racism problem where like the society we live in is sort of structurally racist, right? Well, I've been arguing that in books 6 and 7 of the Republic, Plato is basically arguing that Athenian society is structurally sophistical. It's designed to reward relativism, and it's designed to reward exactly this blurring of the boundary between real and unreal, between true and false, right? So this is why I say that the reality crisis is perennial. It's what Plato was observing in the death of Socrates. He was saying we all basically are raised within these communities where, the heart of mankind is lusting after power. And in order to get power, he has to tell lies. And in order to reinforce the lies, he has to do violence. And that's the crisis, the collapse of Athens. So let me just reread to you one of the portions of that cave metaphor before we go on, so we can keep this in our mind. Remember, the whole point here is ancient wisdom for modern crises, right? What does the ancient wisdom tell us about some of the things our elites are currently thinking and saying? I'm just going to read this again to emphasize a few points, right? This is Socrates. He says, "Make an image of our nature in its education and want of education, likening it to a condition of the following kind. See human beings as though they were in an underground cave-like dwelling, with its entrance, a long one, open to the light across the whole width of the cave. They are in it from childhood, with their legs and necks in bonds, so that they are fixed, seeing only in front of them, unable because of the bond to turn their heads all the way around. Their light is from a fire burning far above and behind them. Between the fire and the prisoners, there is a road above, along which see a wall, built like the partitions puppet handlers set in front of the human beings, and over which they show the puppets. Then also see along this wall human beings, carrying all sorts of artifacts, which project above the wall, and statues of men and other animals wrought from stone, wood, and every kind of material. As is to be expected, some of the carriers utter sounds, while others are silent." Now, lots to say, obviously, always about this image, but let me emphasize 2 points. One I've already talked about, and that is the sophists, right? Or it's not just the sophists, it's the sophists and the politicians who use their relativism to gain power over the masses. And it's the artists, right, who reinforce the idea that the false images on the wall are really the truth, right? And all of these collaborate together to keep the masses in chains, right? That's the whole point of the image. That's what Plato saw going on in the kind of corrupted democracy of Athens. And so you can see why, right, my diagnosis of our present situation is very similar to Plato's diagnosis of Athens, right? That we're sort of overly democratic in the bad sense, that we need everybody to be the same, which means that we have to keep lowering our expectations for everybody. People, are sort of chained to this false sense of reality that is constructed by our sophistical philosophers, our lying politicians, and our regime flunky artists. So you have Ibram X. Kendi reinforcing the systemic racism thing. You have Joe Biden sort of using that to underwrite his domestic terrorism plans, which involved sort of tracking Americans, right, and silencing dissent and political opposition. And then you have artists who sort of reinforce this, late night shows, Stephen Colbert, right, who just mock anybody that thinks differently without ever actually telling any funny jokes, right? That's the trifecta, right? That's the system of people who are carrying the puppets, right? And the puppets reflect shadows on the wall. And so in that circumstance, right, when you have a form of technology that can create ever more realistic images, right, you start to think, well, of course, naturally, when you get that technology, if you live in a world of systemic sophistry, you're going to have people that want to use it to blur that line between true and false, because it's in the political interests of the powerful. Here is the other thing about that opening passage that I want to emphasize, and that is the whole thing begins with comparing the nature of our education and lack thereof, that this has to do with habituation and training. And Plato is saying that, part of the job of the philosopher is to accustom yourself to seeing things in this way. Once you see, cannot unsee, as they say online, right? Once you start to understand that so much of life is designed to perpetuate systems of sophistry for the sake of those who benefit from them, right? To use that same social justice language, right? Once you understand that, you start to see it everywhere. And this is why people talk about getting red-pilled or waking up from the matrix, right? And so in a very deep level, the metaverse is a symptom and not a cause, right? The idea that we might be able to upload our consciousness into the cloud or to blur the line between true and false is not created by the technology. It's a philosophical idea that informs how we're being asked to use the technology. And part of it has to do with the training, right? So let me read now Matthew Ball, who is a online theorist of the metaverse. I think he's got a book about it coming out. It's an interesting website. If you go to his website, just Google Matthew Ball and you'll find it. And he's got these essays explaining some of this sort of Web3 style tech and the development of it. He talks about Fortnite and so forth. Here's something that I found really riveting that he writes, and this is in the book too. I want to read to you a passage from Ball's essay. He says, although all of the he's been talking about COVID and all the changes that have made digital online life more accessible and acceptable for people. He says, although all of the aforementioned changes are significant, none compares to the impact of generational change. For the first 2 or so years following the release of the iPad, it was common to see press reports and YouTube videos of infants and young children that would pick up an analog magazine or book and try to swipe its non-existent touchscreen. These were varyingly adorable, hilarious, and viral. And while we could easily understand what was happening, we couldn't truly appreciate how these frames of reference differed from our own. Now, I remember these videos very well when they first came out, and I found them not only hilarious and touching, but also incredibly chilling and dystopian, actually, that you have this baby, right? And as you're growing up, of course, you learn how objects in the world works. And this is a kid. You can find these on YouTube as well. If you go to Gawker, iPad Baby Can't Work a Magazine, although I actually don't know if Gawker is still up, but The Atlantic, right? And a magazine is an iPad that doesn't work. There's one you can find online. And you can watch these videos of kids because as you learn like shapes and colors, right? I'm talking really formative neurological levels here, like very basic stuff. As you learn shapes and colors, you learn to discern like, oh, well, if I see, a red sort of flitty shape in the green, that's a bird on a tree, right? And you learn to interpret the sensory input that you have. These kids see a rectangle with text and images on it, right? And the only thing they're able to interpret that as is iPad, right? And iPad works a certain way. And so when you get that stimulus, right, then the thing that you do is you interact with the thing outside of you in a certain way. And so these kids are scrolling, right, trying to scroll through the pages rather than turning them because they don't know that there's such a thing as a magazine, which is also a rectangle with images and text, but which works differently than a touchscreen, right? And so you can see in this what Ball is talking about, which is, sometimes we talk about digital natives or we talk about, people who grew up with the internet and never knew a world before the internet. And that is precisely, what we're observing in these kids, because to them, right, their frame of reference is fundamentally digital, right? And what's interesting to me about that is, that part of it, that is an example of something that actually is inevitable, right? We are going to see a whole generation of people come into being, right, who don't remember a world before the internet, who think of this tech as being, sort of part of the world, right? But it's interesting to see that shades naturally over into, and therefore these kids, right, are not going to stigmatize or devalue virtual life, right? Therefore, they're just going to accept virtual existence as just as real as physical embodied existence. And that seems to me like more of a sales pitch, right? That seems like somebody trying to sell you on virtual reality using the habituation and the acculturation that comes from growing up in a digital world, right? And Ball cites all of these interesting statistics. Let me read some more, right? Because the iPad generation grew up with very different expectations, behaviors, and social formats than those that preceded it. Those outside the iPad native cohort looked at Roblox and saw little, if when it did walks. Roblox was and remains visually unimpressive. This is an online game. I've actually never gotten into Roblox, and I have played a lot of Fortnite, but I've never gotten into Roblox. Roblox was and remains visually unimpressive. Its narratives are comparatively, if not objectively, uncompelling. Even its social features were worse than those Gen X, Y, and Boomers are familiar with, such as Snapchat, Instagram, or FaceTime. And even the highly produced games like Fortnite. How could a socializing platform have less capable tools for socializing? To many in the entertainment community, Roblox was understood more along the lines of playing with Lego or watching Nickelodeon, a mostly primitive format that facilitates education and from which we eventually mature into more practical activities like interior decorating or car maintenance, or produced ones such as HBO or The Last of Us. All of these are great uses of time, no better or worse than Roblox, but this logic rarely plays out. Today's generation of children express themselves, often learn, and constantly socialize through virtual worlds they can touch, change, and collaborate in. That's not going to stop. Rather, the capabilities of these virtual worlds will expand, their ease of use will improve, and their significance will grow. What's more, the iPad native generation, or perhaps virtual world native generation, will continue to mature. Most are still consumers, a few are creators, and almost none are business leaders. They will be, and all their frames of reference will lead to transformative change. So Ball is saying two things here, I think, one of which is sort of patently true, right? These kids are going to grow up. They're going to have a different experience of the world than we did, or than I did, I should say, growing up, because they're going to take things like virtual reality as baseline features of the world, right? But what does not follow is that they're going to inherently be unable to distinguish, right, between real and unreal. And the idea that what we're going to get is a generation of kids in the cave, right? Kids who can't see their way out of the falsehoods, right? That's systemic sophistry, right? That's the idea that the whole world is just going to be so constructed that the barrier between virtual and real is not going to mean anything to these kids, right? And that only happens when you actively create a system, right, within which these kids are raised, because it's perfectly possible to take ownership over tech, right? It's perfectly possible to use tech for different things. And it doesn't follow necessarily just because we have virtual reality technology. It doesn't follow that we have to accept that there's no difference between the virtual world and the imaginary world. Some people may have a financial interest, right, in teaching you that that's true. But the role of the cave, right, the point of the cave and the point of studying ancient texts is to understand that you are not chained or bound to that vision of the world that would cause you to use virtual reality tech in that way. There are a million other uses this technology can be put to. It's already being put to some kind of interesting use. It can be good for medical students, for instance, right, to experiment on virtual cadavers, right, and all sorts of training activities like that. Of course, games are fun, and I'm pro video games, so it's fine and fun to play video games, I think, but the philosophical idea, right, that, well, what's the difference between real and unreal? Like, why should reality be so special, right? That's what the cave is designed to do, and it's designed to show you why there is a difference between real and unreal. And it's important to note how Plato does it. He does it by showing you an outside view, by pulling back the camera and showing you the cave from the perspective of somebody who is standing outside of it. And this is, I think, again, talk about this in the book a lot. This is one of the fundamental ways that art helps us to see truth that we can't see from within our own lives. Because, of course, like when you are in Athenian society, and you're just going about your day, and you're trying to get votes in the assembly, and you're trying to fight against the Spartans, or you're doing whatever, right? You're not aware of the atmosphere you live in, the air you breathe, right? And Plato's story basically says, even if you are completely immersed in the sophist's view of life, which says that, that you can make the weaker argument the stronger, and that man is the measure of all things, right? Even if you're completely immersed in that, there is still a perspective from outside that shows you that that is a weakened and small perspective. It's like last week, I think, or maybe 2 weeks ago, I talked about the difference between dreams and waking life, right? People ask, well, how can you know that, you're a butterfly, you're a man dreaming you're a butterfly, rather than a butterfly dreaming you're a man? How do you know that your waking experience is your waking experience and not just another dream, right? And one way that you answer that question is you say, well, there is such a thing, right, as a dream that feels real. But there's no such thing as a dream that feels real when you wake up. And so in your waking life, right, you have a clarity of experience which allows you to look back on your dreaming experience and see, yes, that had a kind of more muddied a more muddied form of sensory experience. It was less clear, and it was obviously your waking life can account for the dreams. You can have a waking life explanation for why you had a dream. In your dream, you can't go the other way around. You can't give an account in your dream of why your waking life was always just a dream, right? Because you're so immersed in your dream. And so these levels, right, of reality, when you pull back the camera, you can see something that might have seemed very real and persuasive in the moment, but when you pull back the camera, you understand that it's not, right? And this is why the Zuckerberg Metaverse press release, right? One of the things that then happened is like Zuckerberg showed you, well, Meta is going to be great. And you're going to put on your virtual reality glasses, and you're going to play poker with people in virtual spaces, and you're going to do all this stuff. And then people were sharing like these images of him walking through a bunch of people with virtual reality glasses, but he didn't have them on, right? That's the Plato view of things. The Plato's eye view of things is to pull back from outside the virtual reality glasses. And no matter what the experience is like, right, of the kid that thinks the magazine is an iPad, or the person that thinks the virtual reality glasses are real, right? if there exists an outside reality that you can see where somebody else can look at you and see, well, you're actually just a person sitting in a chair with glasses on, right? The fundamental question before you is like, is that outside view real? And another way of asking that question is, does anything exist objectively outside of ourselves, right? Because the old ad slogan is, if you are not paying, you're the product, right? The new one, updated for all these Web3 sales pitches, is if you're inside the product, then somebody is outside of it, right? And that is the person that has control. You've handed over control to that person. And so even if this technology is really great, even if there's lots that we can use it for, right? The idea that it's going to consume us, and that we are inevitably going to lose track of the distinction between inside the cave and outside the cave, right? That idea is always a sales pitch, and it's always coming from somebody, just like it was coming from the sophists and from the politicians in Athens, right? It's always coming from somebody who stands to gain. And the trifecta is, right? They tell you that you can accept the lie. If you don't accept the lie, they do violence, or they scorn you, right? And then they basically take what they want using the lies, right? And this is, of course, Solzhenitsyn talks about this. It's a big aspect, I think, of Nietzsche, right? And so this reality crisis that I'm talking about is a perennial feature of the human soul that comes back up again and again in times of crisis, right? And so that's why we're facing it now, is we have all this new tech. We've lost sight of kind of how, what we're here to do in the world. And so once again, powerful people are suggesting to us that it would be best if we just sort of abolished the difference between true and false. And here's another passage that kind of gets at this, from somebody that I have enjoyed before. And none of these people, I don't think, one of the things that I've often said on this show, this is a brief excursus before I read this, but one of the things that I've often said on this show, right, is we have developed this way of thinking that says, well, there are actual like evil people in the world, like Hitler, that do the bad stuff, and they're uniquely evil. And so then we create this kind of demonology, these stories about how the great atrocities of history have happened, that really is wrong. And Solzhenitsyn shows us why it's wrong when he says the line between good and evil runs along every human heart, right? And the horrifying thing is that the people that are proposing these sorts of things aren't actually necessarily bad people. They might have very good intentions and a vision of the universe that looks really great to them. But in my view, right, some of them are making mistakes that inherently within them have the seeds of atrocity. And so, we'll go wrong if we look for, we have to watch out for the next Hitler, right? Because our idea of Hitler isn't an accurate description of what Hitler himself would have been, right? At the time, it would have been like, here's this guy with some ideas that seem bad, and then suddenly it balloons outward into this chaos. And why does it do that? Well, because of some bad ideas at the root of it, right? And so now I'm going to read to you from an interview with Nicolo Soldo, who runs this great Substack interview, and it's Mark Andreessen is the interviewee. And Soldo asks Andreessen, are we too connected these days? COVID has created more shut-ins than ever before, yet the ability to communicate with others has never been cheaper nor easier. For many, the ability to lose oneself has been completely lost, as we are now all expected to be online and within immediate reach during all non-sleep hours. This places great expectations on people, and it is my opinion that it is a negative for our psychological well-being, as we are not programmed for constant, instantaneous contact. So that's Soldo. And Andreessen, who's a tech theorist and a tech mogul, and again, somebody whose work I've benefited from. So I'm not like calling him out here as uniquely evil or anything. I'm just saying I'm gonna read his answer so that we can contemplate more deeply how our leaders are thinking about this stuff, right? He says, your question is a great example of what I call reality privilege. This is a paraphrase of a concept articulated by Bo Cronin, another software developer. Consider the possibility that a visceral defense of the physical and an accompanying dismissal of the virtual as inferior or escapist is a result of superuser privileges. A small percent of people live in a real-world environment that is rich, even overflowing, with glorious substance, beautiful settings, plentiful stimulation, and many fascinating people to talk to and to work with and to date. these are also all of the people who get to ask probing questions like yours. Everyone else, the vast majority of humanity, lacks reality privilege. Their online world is or will be immeasurably richer and more fulfilling than most of the physical and social environment around them in the quote-unquote real world. The reality privileged, of course, call this conclusion dystopian and demand that we prioritize improvements in reality over improvements in virtuality. To which I say, reality has had 5,000 years to get good and is clearly still woefully lacking for most people. I don't think we should wait another 5,000 years to see if it eventually closes the gap. We should build, and we are building, online worlds that make life and work and love wonderful for everyone, no matter what level of reality deprivation they find themselves in. This is a really, I think, fascinating concept of reality privilege, and I would like to take some time in a second to explore it and see what the Platonic answer to it might be. Well, you guys, every week the inflation stuff gets more real, and I wish that, I wish that this ad weren't so appropriate for our times, but you should check out American Hartford Gold. It really is the smart move right now to be diversifying a portion of your portfolio into physical gold and silver, because you will that way resist our present administration's just tendency to print money like there is no tomorrow. And in fact, to do its best to make a situation in which there is no tomorrow, no future for your children by printing all this money. Don't let them get to you that way. Check out American Hartford Gold, and they will help you to diversify your portfolio in physical gold and silver, and they will even help you move your existing IRA or 401k out of the volatile stock market into a precious metals IRA. I don't know if you've been looking at the stock market recently, but that could be a really good idea for some of you. If you call them right now, they will give you up to $1,500 of free silver on your first qualifying order. That's a lot of money, $1,500 worth, when you text the word heretics, HERETICS, to the number 65532. One more time, you got to text the word heretics to the number 65532, and you will be able to diversify your portfolio into gold and silver with the help of American Hartford Gold. Text heretics to 65532 to get started. So Andreessen is articulating here what I think strikes me as the best argument for the reality crisis, for blurring the distinction between real and unreal. I've been saying this whole time, I've been expressing my reality privilege, right? Because my life in the real world is great, right? But most people, their life sucks. And wouldn't it be better if actually they could just have these on-demand Tamagotchi children and could go to virtual parties in Facebook's Metaverse? And, and what about, say, a burn victim, right? Wouldn't it be great if he could have an avatar that didn't reflect his injuries? What about a paraplegic? What if he could feel like he was walking, right? And so the accusation against somebody like me is, well, okay, fine and dandy for you to say, like, go out and lift weights and be in the real world. But like for so many people, that actually isn't really all that great. And so what if instead we just said, like, well, this physical reality has all these limitations and boundaries and difficulties associated with it. Why not just abolish those and make the world into what we make of it? My answer to this is always the selling pitch of the reality crisis, right? Get a world of wonders if you turn in the ability to determine what's true and false. If you just hand over your sense of true and false, of real and unreal, then you will be strong and powerful and fast and free, right? And my answer to this is like, all of those things are good things to be. Strong, powerful, fast, free, I endorse them. I endorse even technology that allows us to do things like make virtual reality. But all of them are idols, and all of them will destroy you if you make them the highest good. I would say that it's much closer to the highest good to say that we love reality not because it's pleasurable, not because it's so much fun all the time, but because it has meaning. And precisely it has meaning because it has rules, right? Because there are things that we actually can't just flip a switch and change. We know in our hearts, in our guts, that there is always going to be more consequence to a baby that loves you because it is a soul with a real inner experience and depends on you because it is a human, right, that needs you for life. That is always going to be more consequential and powerful and meaningful than a baby that you can turn off with a flip of a switch, even if the baby gives you all the same chemical reactions in your brain, right? We know instinctively that we can experience the wonder of the Grand Canyon by pumping imagery into our neurons, right? And yet that feeling of wonder doesn't have the same meaning that it does when we look out on the actual Grand Canyon. Or give another example, right? You can sacrifice yourself for your buddy in Call of Duty, right? You're playing a video game, you can throw yourself on a grenade, get in the way of fire for him, and save him from death, right? Nobody would call that courage the way we would call it courage if somebody did that in real life, as real soldiers do in war, right? And the reason for this is that you can't just switch it off, right? I'm not saying that we shouldn't explore and develop the technologies that we have and see what good things can be made of them. I am saying that once you take away that one plank, the plank of true or false, right? Does 1 + 1 equal 2, or does it equal whatever the party says it is, right? Once you take that away, you think that you're opening the door to a world of wonders, but you're actually unsettling and undermining all things that keep man from the beasts. Because if there's no true and false, then you end up in a war of all against all. And that is what Athens discovered. Let me read a passage now from the book, from How to Save the West, that sort of gets at how this attitude has been brewing with us for a long time. That has nothing to do, actually, or that the metaverse and the sort of idea of virtual reality is a symptom rather than a cause of this reality crisis. So here's a passage from the first chapter of the book. Digital technology has allowed for an enormous proliferation of information, but also given unprecedented power over that information to a handful of people with their own political interests. One favored method for taking control of reality is to shut down debate about it altogether. Many in digital technology are sympathetic to this tactic, setting standards of censorship on political speech, restrictions on misinformation, and even banning prominent figures, including the President of the United States, from social media platforms. In the lead up to the 2020 presidential election, the New York Post broke a story about candidate Joe Biden's son, Hunter. Hunter's laptop contained emails and photos linking him to a Ukrainian energy company and potentially implicating the future president himself in a lucrative deal with CEFC China Energy, a state-controlled conglomerate. The Post was consequently shut out of its Twitter account, and Facebook reduced the reach of the story. While I will intentionally not link to the New York Post, wrote Facebook's communications officer Andy Stone, I want to be clear that this story is eligible to be fact-checked by Facebook's third-party fact-checking partners. In the meantime, we are reducing its distribution on our platform. Before Twitter reversed its stance, people were blocked from sharing the article even over direct message. After the election, when President Donald Trump began making accusations of electoral fraud and claiming he had won, he was removed from Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram entirely. Over a year later, in March of 2022, reporters at the New York Times dropped a casual acknowledgement that the laptop was in fact genuine. This total revision of accepted truth came without apology or even introspection from reporters who had previously smothered the story. Twitter's corporate statement on civic integrity articulates a rationale for this kind of behavior. Our service shows the world what's happening and democratizes access to information. And at its best, it also provides insights into diverse perspectives on critical issues, all in real time. But the fight against malicious activity and abuse goes beyond any single election or event. And so Twitter's overseers must determine what should and should not be said, developing better tools and resources for finding and stopping abuse, and taking extensive action against activity that violates the Twitter rules. In this context, as social media corporations labor to position themselves as arbiters of truth, Facebook's transformation into Meta starts to look less like a triumph of the human spirit and more like a consummation of the reality crisis. Making a bid to create the metaverse means making a bid to construct the contours of the world. It is an attempt to gain control, not just over what can be said, but over what reality itself looks like. And it is presented as a gesture of liberation, as if we are being broken free from a restrictive and outmoded reality. We are promised untold power and pleasure if we just abjure our responsibility to determine true from false, if we hand over the power to determine what exists. The technology involved in this promise is new, but the promise itself is an old one. This is not the first time that pop philosophers and salesmen have suggested scrapping the basic distinction between real and unreal. So what I am saying here, what I'm trying to convey, right, is that I'm not here to predict to you the future of Facebook Meta or whether they'll eventually figure it out. I'm here to uncover the logic that is underneath all of these statements, because ultimately, right, these sorts of endeavors, these endeavors to take control over true and false, they collapse, right? But they do a lot of damage on the way out. And so part of the idea of this book, part of the idea of talking about this stuff on the show is to suggest, right, that by recognizing these things, by pulling the camera back in that Platonic cave way, right, we at least can equip ourselves to call BS on some of these proclamations of all the things that are going to happen to us in the future. And isn't it going to be so great, right? The impulse to tell those stories, to tell the story of the cave, to make the movie The Matrix, right? To, even like Wall-E, right, is an example of this. That artistic impulse is an impulse to assert and affirm that there is a perspective, even if we ourselves are completely embroiled in the cave, in systemic sophistry, right? Even if we're just totally subject to it, there exists a perspective, an outside perspective from which we are not free, but we are made slaves by the transaction. And so next week, I'm going to start talking about the way out of this. And I'm going to start talking about the dangers of handing over the responsibility for determining true and false, even to well-meaning people, even to people you like, even to people who seem very smart and competent. But for now, let's take a mailbag question. I bet that you are holding tension in your body that you don't even know about. I know that I was before I started using Theragun. Somebody gave me a Theragun for Christmas before they were a sponsor, and I was so stoked when they signed on to sponsor the show because this is really a useful tool that more people ought to be using. You guys know I'm a bit of a health nut. I love working out. I especially love lifting weights, and that's bound to produce some tension. But, so that part I knew that I was going to have some aches and pains that would, percussive therapy would help them. But what I didn't predict is that just my daily life of like walking around, sitting in front of a computer, all the things that we do day to day, no matter what other part of our life we might lead, right? That creates tension too. And you might not even feel it because it's just normal for you, right? It's like the water that fish swim in. The Gen 4 Theragun relieves that tension and gets to the source of all your muscle pain by going 60% deeper than vibration alone. It's really a handy tool. It's very quiet and easy to use, and you can try it for 30 days, starting at only $199 if you are a Young Heretics listener. Here's how you do it. When you go to therabody.com/heretics. That's just for my listeners, so go to that link, therabody.com/heretics to get your Gen 4 Theragun today. That's therabody.com/heretics, therabody.com/heretics. Mailbag questions come to me on Locals. It's at youngheretics.com/locals. It's this incredible community of VIPs, folks who don't just love the show, but want to take the ideas deeper, take the ideas of the show deeper and apply them to everyday life, kind of like how we were talking about today. One of the great things about the VIP community is that people have an opportunity to like ask me about stuff that's going on with them specifically. We can talk about, well, what would Plato say about this or that? Or what would Aristotle say? Right? How about Machiavelli? And that kind of engagement is what you'll get on Locals. I obviously can't do that with everybody because there's just, gratefully, joyously, I have a good problem, which is too many people to do this with everybody. But if you become a VIP at youngheretics.com/locals, you will get access to that kind of exclusive content. And let me say, by the way, that if you like this show, even if you're not a VIP, it would really mean a lot to me if you would let people know about it and share it. Not just the book, How to Save the West, but the show itself, Young Heretics, only gets bigger, only grows, only continues to do its thing if you give it 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, if you share it on social media, if you tell your friends about it, subscribe if you haven't subscribed already so you'll never miss an episode. All of these things help carry the mission of the show forward. And if I may say so, I believe in the mission of this show. That's why I'm doing it. If you think this is content that needs sharing as well, please do help me out by sharing it. But for now, let's take a mailbag question from Aravir on Locals. Aravir writes, you spoke about the podcast about how it isn't virtuous to be a bullied nerd. Yeah, so this was on a couple episodes ago. I was talking about the never-ending story and this trope, this narrative trope that we have, that the bullied nerd turns out to get his, justification in the end, and the bullies are lame and they, never amount to anything, right? I was wondering how our culture came to glorify this trope, and hence the rise of victim culture. The first thing that came to mind was the Beatitudes and similar Christian doctrines like turn the other cheek. I believe Christianity has been a net good to society, but in this subject, it seems to have gone too far. how can our culture recover from this attitude of glorifying the downtrodden? Just being nice to people and raising good kids doesn't seem to be slowing our slide into the craziness. Is every culture just doomed in the end, so it's not worth worrying about? Well, it's funny. I actually talk a little bit about this in the book that, every culture is doomed in the end, and nobody knows where they are in the cycle of regimes. The owl of Athena flies at dusk. You can only tell history in retrospect, right? So there is a level in which, like, what's going to happen is going to happen, and it's not your job to save the world. It's your job to save the West, which is to say, to preserve in your family, in your sphere of influence, in your heart, the true, the good, and the beautiful principles that have been passed down for generations. That's your job. It's not your job to save the world, or even to save America single-handedly, right, from disaster. But that doesn't mean it's not worth worrying about, because you do have a sphere of influence, and you personally have, truth matters. It matters to know what is true, and even if eventually the downfall is inevitable, it's not inevitable today, right? We're always kind of trying to reverse the decline. We're like doctors, trying to prolong the life of the good things that we believe in, like America or Western culture, for instance. So this corruption, let's say, of Christianity. I mean, what you're saying, Aravir, it sounds very much like Nietzsche. And in some ways, this analysis of the corruption of Christianity is a lot like Nietzsche. And I've just been reading this other philosopher, Del Noce, who writes about this as well, that, when Christianity becomes just a softening force, then it starts to look like a slave mentality. Slave morality is what Nietzsche called it, right? It's just this kind of way of inverting values so that weak people can glorify over the strong. And it's, in that sense, it's just another Thrasymacheian power grab, right? It's just another effort to structure the world so that your team wins. And this is a very powerful critique of a certain form of decadent Christianity. It's similar in many ways to how Machiavelli regarded the church of his day, although with some changes for a time period, right? But the idea that, like, when the church becomes corrupt, then it becomes a sort of shadow version of itself. I do think that, like, this obsession that we have with victims and with not only respecting and loving victims, but with wanting to become victims, right? This is a kind of corruption of turn the other cheek, because what Christianity does is it steps into the logic of the ancient world, which is the logic of the world, right? Which is just the strong survive, right? The strong do what they can while the weak suffer what they must. Steps into that logic and says, no, God identifies with the weak and loves and preserves the weak. And his eye is upon the weak. And what you do unto them represents what you do unto God, right? The way that you behave toward the beggar, the way that you behave toward the hungry, the naked, ultimately that expresses your attitude toward God. And every heresy, every corruption of Christianity is just taking some portion of Christianity without the rest. And so what we've done is we've said, well, God loves the lowly, and we want to be loved by God, so let's become the lowly, right? And what Jesus says is something a little bit different. He says, you are already beloved of God. And so release your desire to earn God's love and simply love those whom God loves, right? The point of the Good Samaritan, the point of the person in need, the point of the victim, is not to try to make yourself into the biggest victim you can be, but to seek out the real victims whom you can help and to have that heart for people. And there's no getting away from that, right? I mean, my dad and I were talking about this in his show. He has this idea that, Christianity is the truth. And so anything that kind of moves away from it is just a corruption. It's just moving backward. It's not moving forward. But there is a way in which, right, especially with Marx, right, Marx, who kind of takes this concern for the downtrodden and makes it into a totalizing theory of the world, that the proletarian shall rise up, right? Without acknowledging the parts of Christianity that say, well, it's not your job to become that guy. It's your job to help that guy, right? And to be, insofar as we become lowly as Christians, we do so to help others, right? And so it's actually weirdly selfish, right? This identification with the victim, because it says, well, if the victim is who gets all the goodies in a Christian society, then I'm going to become the victim as a way of getting the goodies, right? And so weirdly, Nietzsche's observation becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It does become a kind of slave morality, right? That teaches people to seek objection, not because objection, is somehow holy, but because objection gets you goodies. And that's kind of, I think, what Marx has done to Christianity. And my answer to how to resolve this is the way to resolve all heresies, which is to put it back into the context of the whole gospel, all of the gospel, right? And so when you really read all the gospels, Jesus isn't a wilting flower at all. Jesus takes a whip to the tables of the money changers in the temple, right? Jesus gets mad and comes to bring not peace but a sword, right? All of these kind of confident assertions that Jesus makes, right? We have to stop associating Christianity with just this kind of weak delicacy. Christianity is a robust and strong love for the broken, right? Christianity is so strong that it can actually stand in between the world and the broken and take the blows of the world, right? That's the whole point of Jesus, and that's the whole point of being a disciple of Jesus. And there is, I think it's a Teddy Roosevelt quote. I can't remember who says this. Ryan Mickler on the Order of Man podcast is always quoting this idea that the good man stands between his family and the world, absorbing the blows of fate, and that's kind of the proper idea of Christian victimology, is that God identifies with the victim, and so pour out your heart onto the victim. Don't become the victim yourself in a sort of cynical ploy to get the goodies. So Marxism has been often called the last heresy. I think there's a lot to that, and I think our neo-Marxism, our cultural Marxism, is basically just another perversion of this idea that because the weak are beloved of God, therefore we should all desire to become weak. And if you read the gospel, that's not what it's about at all. Because the weak are beloved of God, we should desire to be strong in defense of the weak. That's the kind of, I think, the answer to heresy is always the whole gospel. Okay, thanks for that question, Aravir. Thank you guys for going with me on this journey. I'm super excited to start uncovering some of these ideas that are in the book too. And also, of course, because the podcast gives us this opportunity to, explore them at length and talk about some of these modern things as well as the ancient ideas. We're going to keep on with this next week before moving on to some new topics. So thank you as always. If you like this show, you will love the Claremont Institute where I work. It's really a great place, an institute for the recovery of the American idea. We put out the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind, which I talked about at the beginning of this episode. And you can find us online. You can donate at claremont.org/donate, which really helps. Mention if you do that you heard about us through Young Heretics, which would be great. And I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.